Welcome to a breaking event interview on the extraordinary and rapidly unfolding developments in Syria, covering late November to today, December 8th. In this special episode, we're joined by retired CIA Senior Intelligence Service Officer and former State Department diplomat Glenn Korn. This conversation is part of the Mad Minute, Glenn's series delivering sharp geopolitical analysis and expert interviews on critical global issues. Glenn brings unmatched expertise to the discussion with over 3 decades of service in the U.S. government, including assignments in Turkey, Russia, and extensive work on Middle Eastern affairs and counterterrorism. If you're curious about Glenn's remarkable career, we previously explored his experiences in both the CIA and State Department on Combat Story. In today's episode, we dive into the key events leading to Assad's departure from Damascus, the swift advances of HTS and SDF forces toward the capital, the broader implications for regional players, and what strategic moves the U.S. should consider next. With that, please enjoy this expert analysis with Glenn Korn. All right, Glenn, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down and walk through some current events with us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you, Ryan, and I hope the family's well and everyone's getting ready for the holidays.
Likewise. And for people listening, I mean, we're filming this the evening of Sunday, December 8th, which I feel is important just given some of the events in Syria. So I just wanted to start with a very high-level timeline for people who are tracking this. Because things are unraveling so quickly, some of the dates might not be perfect, but effectively late November, you've got Hayat, Tahrir al-Sham, which will have HTS, is moving south from northwest Syria. They take Aleppo, Hama, Homs. Syria and Russia respond with airstrikes about a week ago in early December. Just a few days ago, around December 6th, Iran evacuates its diplomats, citizens, and Quds Force. You've got the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast, moving south as well. They take Deir ez-Zor, and you have a convergence outside of Damascus, basically yesterday, the 7th. And then today, the 8th, rebels enter Damascus. Assad flees for Moscow. Russia grants him asylum, from what we can tell. Israel takes some airstrikes at Iranian and Hezbollah positions in Damascus. And then the U.S. makes some airstrikes, about 75 or what are reported, targeting ISIS in central Syria. What am I missing on that, Glenn, from a just high-level timeline?
No, it's a very accurate timeline. Not a lot going on in Syria, or in the region, in the Levant.
Is your phone just lighting up with people asking you for what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I would mention is just on the eve of all this, the Israelis and Lebanese Hezbollah, but pushed by the Iranians, came to a ceasefire agreement, right? And so this is an important topic because the Lebanese armed forces now have to secure their southern border with Israel to keep that ceasefire in place, although there have already been violations. So Hezbollah has continued to launch strikes into northern Israel, and the Israelis have responded. They've made it clear they're going to continue to respond. But the Lebanese armed forces has got to secure the border as part of that agreement, but now they also have to worry about their northern border. So we can touch on all of that, but of course, with everything happening in Syria, a lot of questions now about who is going to be in charge of what part of Syria.
With that, just before we jump into some of the players here and the different regions, you also mentioned that you had just read about Russia pulling out from a couple key locations. Can you just speak to that real quick for a lay of the land?
Yeah, if the open source reporting is correct, it looks like they're pulling out their assets out of Tartus Naval Base, which they've been in since the 1970s. It's a critical warm water port for Moscow because it's their only port on the Mediterranean. And then my understanding is, I think it's Hamani Air Base in Syria, that they're also moving assets out of there. That is reporting coming from Ukrainian sources, if I read the article correctly. So you have to be a little bit careful there, because sometimes, I just say, as our great President Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. But if it's true that the Russians are pulling out of those bases, that is very, very significant and extremely interesting.
What do we know about this group, Hayat, Tahrir al-Sham, previously or formerly known as Nusra Front or al-Nusra?
Yeah, I mean, some elements were Nusra. In the Syrian civil war, there was a lot of back and forth, changing of flags. Um, some of the elements, some of the core were connected with Nusra. My understanding is Jolani, the leader now, left. He had a falling out or a disagreement on policy with al-Nusra, and he created HTS with support from the Turkish government. They claim to be more moderate, and my own assessment is the Turks have been working very hard to moderate them. The first thing that he announced when he entered Aleppo was that they were not going to go after any minorities. They were not going to go after the Alawites. They were not going to go after Christians. That they wanted to, turn a page in Syrian history. I'm sure that is part of the messaging campaign that Ankara would like them to deliver, and hopefully it's sincere if they want to stabilize Syria. But there are a lot of elements that were packed into HTS, and of course there's a lot of concern now in the region, and of course I'm sure in Washington, about what's going to happen going further, whether some of the more extremist groups are going to emerge. Because if you remember, in the heart, when the fighting was really going on with the Syrian opposition, what was known as the Syrian opposition, there were all kinds of elements, including what became ISIS, Nusra, variations of, Nusra was Al-Qaeda, other variations of Al-Qaeda. You mentioned the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, which are known as the SDF YPG, also known in the Turkish view as the PKK, which is a terrorist group for the Turks. So all kinds of activity, and some of it very dangerous.
You bring up a good point. So we've got Jelani kind of leading HTS. When he moves in today, he's announced, as you said, kind of a transition government and looking out for minority rights. And I think he appoints or has designated former Prime Minister Mohammed Jalali as the transition leader, who has also, sounds like, agreed to have elections and some transition period. And the other thing you mentioned with the Alawites that I do think is important, Syria, and you know this better than anyone, Glenn, so catch me if you feel this is off, 74% Sunni, 13% Shia, which includes the Alawites who have led, under Assad, who have led Syria for 50 years, and then 10% Christian and others in that area, which is not insignificant, as I'm sure we're going to touch on with Iran and Israel and all the neighbors.
Right. Yeah, correct. I mean, I think those numbers are relatively accurate, as best anyone can tell. The Sunni were definitely the minority, but they were oppressed by the Assad regime, by the Alawites. Of course, there is a Christian community. There's an Armenian Christian community. There are other Christians. Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire for many years. Then there was a French mandate for control of Syria. It's gone through a very tumultuous history, let's say modern history, since it had its independence. At one point, it formed an alliance with Iraq. They were one country for a short period. Oh, sorry, not Egypt, right? And they also occupied Lebanon for years. Some people claim that parts of Lebanon are actually Syria, which, the word in Arabic, El Sham, basically the Levant. And so Syria has been in some kind of state of hostilities with war or hostilities with Israel for many years. Then the civil war, which is a result of the Assad regime's oppression of the Sunni community population and kind of dictatorial rule. There have been different variations of uprisings, but when the civil war started in the mid-2000s, it became very intense. And there was a period when Assad was in trouble. He was bailed out by the Iranians and their militias, mainly Lebanese Hezbollah, and then the Russians, who came in with a lot of noise. And, this was Vladimir Putin's. This is what I think is one of the significant points here, Ryan. This was Putin's attempt, or Putin's opportunity, to kind of replace the Russian flag in the Middle East and to demonstrate that Russia was still a world power and the United States was in decline, because the administration at the time, during the Obama administration, there was a lot of back and forth and, let's say, hesitancy on what our policy in Syria should be. We probably allowed a vacuum to form a void, and Putin rushed in to fill that. One native of the region told me 2 days ago that now this demonstrates for years a lot of Syrians, Lebanese, residents of the region thought that Russia was a very powerful country, but now they're having second thoughts about how powerful Russia really is, right? And of course, Iran, which had created its Shia, the axis of resistance, is now in retreat, having serious problems both in Lebanon. Lebanese Hezbollah has been seriously
degraded. Huh?
Degraded, thank you. Yeah. Degraded by the Israelis, by Israeli strikes and operations. And of course, strikes in Iran, which have showed that the Iranian regime is also not as powerful as people thought in the region. And now what's happening in Syria is probably even more humiliating for Tehran and for Moscow.
Is it surprising to you that Assad went to Moscow instead of one of those other allies?
No, it's not surprising at all. I think it probably suits his lifestyle and his family's lifestyle. And I'm sure Putin wants to salvage whatever he can for his reputation by showing he's a loyal friend to someone like Assad and a fellow dictator. But I'm not surprised. No, I'm sure he preferred living in Moscow than Tehran.
Who do you think missed that this was building up and happening? Like you mentioned the speed of how quickly this happened. Obviously, Assad didn't have to leave the last time this got close, and he left within a week here.
Right. I don't know who missed it. I would say that we saw in 7 October of last year, I think that probably the U.S. was behind the curve. There was a desire here in Washington to turn away from the Middle East and focus on, the famous pivot to China, pivot to Asia. At the time, I said, the Middle East is never going to let that happen. It's going to demand Washington's attention. And I don't know what was going on inside the government here, what people saw, didn't see, but we can definitely say that the public has been surprised. My guess is that the Turks may initially have been surprised with the speed of HTS's progress, but probably better informed than most people since they have a close relationship with HTS. And based on discussions I've had with people in Lebanon, it sounds like the Lebanese have also been surprised at how quickly the regime fell. I think some people felt that after Aleppo fell, that Assad would be able to hold on, that the Russian and Iranian airstrikes would help him. But what we've seen is that was too little, not enough. And the Iranians and the Russians are not in a position to save Assad this time. And Lebanese Hezbollah, which is, again, thanks to Israel, has been dealt a serious blow, significantly degraded, as you said.
If you were still, in the government working, and this is happening right now, and you're kind of focused on the region,
I wouldn't be on your podcast.
True. What are you thinking will happen next, and what would you be advising the administration?
Great question. I think a couple of things. One, we absolutely have to watch how things develop. If the moderates hold on to power in Syria, this could be a great moment for Syria and for the region. A couple of strategic goals I think we have to have. One is to deny Iran the ability in the future to resupply Hezbollah or rebuild Hezbollah in Lebanon. So we have to watch Lebanon itself. As I mentioned, Lebanon, even before 7 October, was struggling economically, socially. There was the largest number of Syrian refugees in the world per capita. That was putting a strain on the Lebanese economy. There's been no president in Lebanon since October of 2022, and the Lebanese have not been able to elect a president. So the government has been a caretaker government, which has not been as effective as you would have if you had a full-time president and a cabinet. And Nasrallah made a strategic mistake when he decided to open up a front against Israel on 7 October in alliance with Hamas. And now we see that some people said at the time that's a mistake, and he definitely made a mistake. The Iranians made a mistake, in my assessment, by letting him do that and using him to do that because they lost their best pawn on the chessboard in the region. So we've got to watch Lebanon. I wrote an article about this at that time. We don't want to see a void created or if there's a void, we have to help the legitimate authorities in Lebanon fill that void, fill the vacuum. So it's same in Syria. Now there's going to be a scramble to figure out who the legitimate forces are and who is capable of filling the vacuum before groups like ISIS reemerge in force, or Nusra, or some new form of extremists, either Shia or Sunni extremists, emerge. And if you remember ISIS in 2014, it was a non-issue, and all of a sudden everybody was stunned by how quickly they were able to spread their influence in Syria and Iraq. So we've got to watch that very carefully. And we've got to work with, I believe, my own assessment is, Ryan, we've got to work with the Turks very closely. I've been saying for a long time, Turkey is a critical ally. We've got to work that has its own interests, and we've got to take those interests, factor those interests into our policy decisions. And of course, the Lebanese state, we've got to help Lebanon now. We've got to help them secure the southern border so we don't have any more fighting with Israel, which is a key ally, and the northern border in case things get out of control in Syria. We have, of course, a major ally in Jordan. I'm sure they're concerned right now in the border. And my understanding is that the Israelis have deployed troops not only to their border with Syria, but actually on the Syrian side of the border to secure that side of the border because they're concerned with the potential spread of extremist groups into Israel. And then the last policy piece, I think here, my advice is it's time to reassess our relationship with the SDF YPG. And we need to ask ourselves whether that relationship is worth continued problems with our bilateral relationship with Ankara. At this time, I've been arguing for a while that Turkey is a strategic partner that we need to consider very carefully when we make policy decisions. If you recall, when the Obama administration decided to support the SDF, I think that the comment or the claim was it was temporary, transactional, and tactical. That was 2014, and 10 years later, for the Turks, they'll tell you it doesn't seem very temporary. So you can bet your bottom lira. That was a little joke there for the audience. You can bet your bottom, I don't know, that dollar that the Turks are now going to pressure the incoming administration to end our support for the SDF and YPG. Now, if we do that, if we withdraw our troops from Syria, I think we probably have, 600, they say 800, I don't know. But if President Trump decides to go forward and remove U.S. forces from Syria, I would argue that we have to make a demand on Ankara that that no atrocities are committed against the Kurds, and that also that we have the right and we have their full support and cooperation to go after any extremist groups that emerge or that present threats to the U.S. homeland or any of our allies.
What's the hardest of those objectives politically to get through over the next few months in the U.S., you think?
In the U.S.? Well, one, I think, we'll have to see how the cabinet is staffed, who President Trump has in key positions, what their views are. But I think, there's a weariness about the Middle East. There was in the previous Trump administration, there was a desire, President Trump was elected saying he doesn't want any wars. So I don't think anyone wants to get into another conflict. There may be, there was major pushback within the U.S. or at least within the Beltway against, abandoning the Kurds before. When President Trump made that decision, he reversed the decision later. My understanding is under pressure both internally in the U.S. and from some of our European allies who did not want us to end that support for the SDF YPG. So, I think those are going to be policy challenges. And of course, again, how we deal with Lebanon, is there going to be a president? It's interesting. The Speaker of Parliament in Lebanon called for elections on 9 January. He wants to elect a president, which is a good thing. But I think some members of the incoming administration have asked the Lebanese not to rush because they want to get into office and have some say in what the next 4 years is going to be. So my understanding is the new special envoy or the special advisor for the Middle East that President Trump has named, came out publicly and said, don't rush. And my read of that is give us time to get into office and review the candidates because in Lebanon, it's important who the right to have to pick the right candidate for president. Now, that should be a decision of the Lebanese people, right? But
Yep.
if they pick a cabinet who, and this is just my assessment, my opinion, if they pick a pro-Hezbollah candidate or someone who's too willing to uh, give up Lebanon's interests for an outside power, then I would personally say we shouldn't provide any reconstruction assistance to
Mm.
Lebanon, which would be a shame because there's a lot we could do, and they need a lot of help.
Would any of this, the activities in the last week or two, have been possible without what happened in Ukraine and Israel, like October 7 and Russia, Ukraine?
It's hard to imagine that it could have. I mean, I think the Israelis and the Ukrainians and the Turks, three important allies for the United States, have handed us a potential for like a game changer in Syria
Mm-hmm.
and Lebanon. So the Israelis, of course, a highly effective campaign, which, any military expert, any intelligence expert should, hats off. It's been very, very impressive, and you have to give the Israelis credit for how effective they've been. The Ukrainians for their resilience, and for, Vladimir Putin has had to expend a lot of resources after failing to take Kiev in 3 days like he thought he would in February 2022. And the battlefield remains very, very painful for the Russians. And the Turks, who have consistently stayed with HTS and some of the Syrian opposition. And I think, my own assessment is some of the success on the battlefield that HTS has had has probably been because they've been helped by a very professional military.
What's your take on how Putin is feeling now and what you think he'll do next based on this?
Yeah. It's hard for me to know how Putin's feeling. I hope that's a good thing. My guess is he's very worried because one dictator has collapsed. We have to watch Iran, by the way, internally. How is this going to impact things for the regime? Which is also, okay, the Assad regime was very unpopular with the Syrian people. I would argue even with many of the Alawites,
Yeah.
right? But he maintained power with outside support and the use of force. Now Iran, the Iranian regime is very unpopular with the Iranian people. Many Iranians want change. Is this going to send this like a spark or a wave through Iran that's going to result in some kind of change in Iran? And then, of course, in Russia itself. I'm sure that Putin is very worried because he doesn't look good right now. Again, his promise to the Russian people when he came to power in the early 2000s, in late 1999, 1999, 2000, was that he was going to bring Russia up from its knees after the chaos of the 90s. He was going to give the Russian people the respect, or the Russian state, the respect that it deserved. He was going to remind the world that Russia was a superpower, equal to the United States, if not stronger, and that Russia needed to be contended with. And he was going to fix the Russian economy. Well, I think what we're seeing now, especially after his mistaken policy in Ukraine in 2014 and then 2022, is that the Russian economy is in the dumps. The Russians are suffering as a result of his strategic mistakes. There are estimates between, I think, 600 to 700,000 Russian casualties on the battlefield in Ukraine. I would argue that the amount of territory that they've taken is not worth those number of lives. And social problems are on the rise inside of Russia. Many people here in the States don't talk about that because Putin's propaganda has been so effective. And they've tried to prove, we're more resilient and everything is fine in Russia, and the Ukrainians and the US, everyone has problems. But I think now, like what's happening in Syria shows that is actually, that's a myth. It's a Potemkin village. The Russians are not that powerful. Putin's not that strong. He doesn't have that much influence. And I hope that our recent elections here, too, have shown the Russians that the American people went out to vote. They are politically active, and they made a choice. And hopefully we'll have unity in the U.S. government and a little bit less polarization going forward, because that's another very, very strong message to guys like Putin and the people in Russia who are definitely watching. And they didn't see chaos during the election in November. There was no chaos in the United States. God bless, thank God. And now, Putin was hoping for that. He was hoping he could show the Russian people that look, the Americans are chaotic, but at least we have stability here. Now it's the opposite.
Does Russia try to keep a toe in the region?
Again, if they're really pulling out of Tartus, that is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
My assessment would be they want to, but the question is, can they? Right? They may have to retract and then try and reassert themselves later. And of course, we have to vet the information if it's true that they're really
Yeah.
pulling out. I've only seen one article, and I have to stress that they could be trying to hold on. There were meetings in Qatar between the Russians, the Iranians, and who else was there? Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And I'm sure they're trying to forge some kind of agreement. The Russians are going to try and make the best or do the best they can to hold on to some influence and save face. So we'll see. But if it's true that the Russians are skedaddling, they're going to have a hard time getting back.
Yeah. So we've seen obviously Arab Spring changes over decade and a half plus now. Is there anything we should be learning from those that we might see play out in Syria that you would be advising?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, one, we have to be realistic. We have to understand the history and the culture. I personally think we shouldn't demand from the people, let's say in Syria, that they, let's just look at the example of Afghanistan, where we unrealistically, in my assessment, thought that we could turn Afghanistan into another United States or European country in 10 years or 20 years. Historically, realistically, culturally, socially, that was not realistic. So we need to be very, very sensitive to the cultural realities in the region. I think we have to manage our expectations and be willing to be patient, as long as whoever takes over in Syria abides by some kind of standard of not doing to the population what the Assad regime had been doing to the population. And we're just going to have to watch very carefully. I hate to say it, but I am concerned that some extremist groups will emerge, but I'm also concerned that Moscow and Tehran and whatever remnants are of the Assad regime, the Ba'ath Party now in Moscow or outside the country, are going to try and use the Sunni extremist threat to reassert their power, which I would argue they did before. And
That's what they did before.
That's what they did before. And they got everyone's attention and everyone nervous about the Sunni extremist threat. So they reduced the pressure on themselves. So we've got to watch that very carefully. And we need to be very, very, in my opinion, patient and thoughtful when we respond to information about potential Sunni threats, and really dig and figure out where they're coming from if we want to disrupt the real source.
Is there a way that we really screw this up in the next few months? Is there something we do that really, like this is a huge opportunity, like you said, we've basically been handed an opportunity in a very volatile region?
I would argue the way that we could screw it up is to be indecisive, to just try and ignore it, not to take advantage of opportunities, and or to ignore the interests of our allies in the region and assume that they just will accept our policy decisions, which I don't think they are going to do, if that makes sense.
It does.
We're going to have to compromise with our allies.
How do you see the country being broken up, if at all? And I don't mean like into separate entities or countries or regions, but just you kind of alluded to it as we were kicking off. I mean, we've got some effort in the Northwest with HTS. We've got SDF in the Northeast. We've got Alawites. We've got Sunni majority. Do you see any of that breaking slightly within Syria?
I guess there's a potential, but I think what's so complicated is they're all intermixed and intertwined. So it's not, simple like one whole region. I mean, I guess, like Idlib could split away. But even there, it's very complicated because you have the Kurds, you have the Sunnis, you do have pockets of Alawites. So I hope the country doesn't break apart. Some people have suggested there may be some parts of Lebanon may cede and go to Syria, and there may be some new form of Syrian state. And then other parts of Lebanon would become Lebanon or state Mount, like they talk about Mount Lebanon. I hope that doesn't happen. I don't think that we want the whole region fracturing. And again, this is where we're going to need our allies to help us and to advise us, because some of them know the region better than we do.
I got basically two more questions that I just wanted to hit you with. And one is about who understands the region best. And clearly, the allied picture makes complete sense. From your time in government, many decades there, is there somebody who you think should be really advising leadership on what's happening here today?
Well, I mean, I would say we have a lot of people that are very well educated, very smart. They spend a lot of time in the region. I worked with two ambassadors. They were excellent, excellent experts in the region. Hopefully they'll turn to those people and ask them to play some role in the future administration. We have a lot of talent, and we have a lot of, unfortunately, because of the war on terror and everything that happened in the region, we have a lot of people from the military side and the intelligence community side that spent a lot of time on the ground and developed a lot of relationships. I hope the new administration taps into that. And one thing I would say is I hope that we don't, sometimes I think the way that we approach like staffing key positions is a little myopic. We either go to business people or we go to just State Department. But there's a lot more talent out there in the talent pool, people that spend a lot of time on the ground.
And then lastly, I think I know the answer to this, but I am curious. Does the UN have a role to play in what's going on now?
Sure, of course the UN does. A very complicated question because of all the challenges associated with the UN. And, I would suggest that US public opinion of the UN is not very high. Of course, we saw some of the stuff that was happening in Gaza and some of the accusations, and I think actually, concerns that the Israelis had about the way the UN was handling things. Let's say people involved in or part of the UN missions that were too close to groups like Hamas are actually supporting them. So not objective, not, neutral parties. So the UN has challenges. But the UN, I guess, can play a role, especially in the humanitarian aid area. If you look like the UN forces, the UNIFIL forces in Lebanon, they're supposed to be securing the border. But if you read the reporting, they were unable to do their job. Hezbollah was building bases and tunnels right next to the UN bases. They were, seizing UN troops when they were trying to patrol the border area, harassing them. And, in the future, as part of this agreement between Israel and Lebanon for the ceasefire, the LAF should be able to rely on UN forces there to actually do their job, and they should be empowered to do their job. Sometimes I think we forget that a lot, like the UN forces, they're often not given the political support they need to actually execute the mission that they're given, right? And so none of us would envy them to be put on the ground. We remember in the Balkans and in other places where they're put on the ground, but they're not allowed to use force to protect themselves or execute mission for very political reasons. So, personally, I don't think the UN is going to play the lead role, and we shouldn't count on that for many, many reasons. But there's probably a role they can play.
Anything else we should be covering for this kind of breaking event? We talked about a lot of players, right? I mean, Iran, Israel, Russia, Turkey, the Kurds. We haven't mentioned Saudi and some of the other bigger players in the region.
Yeah, the Gulf states are key players, right? They are going to have a say. They have a lot of the financing needed to help rebuild the region. They have a lot of influence for other reasons, religious reasons, cultural reasons. So yeah, I mean, the Gulf countries should have a say, and there are some of the key allies I'm talking about that we're going to have to work very closely with and consider their input. We're going to have to watch Iraq, of course, because Iraq is another part of the potential domino if things get out of control, and we still have forces there. And then, Ryan, I would just say this, like, shifting around the world, but look, as all this was happening, we had a South Korean president declare martial law, right? And that, I have a friend who's in the crypto market, and he was going crazy trying to figure out how that was going to impact the crypto market. And, we just have so many issues to track all the time. And I say this all the time, but the world is very, very complex now. And a lot of this stuff is all interconnected in one way or another. So as South Korea is having this political crisis, We have 10,000 North Korean troops in Kursk, fighting with the Russians. We have the Ukrainian Minister of Defense going to Seoul to try and secure support from the South Korean government, which would be great for Ukraine. So it's all interconnected. And of course, Iranian drones killing Ukrainian civilians that are being launched by the Russians. By the way, I hope that all these events will help us also make it clear to Iran they're going to stop that support for Moscow. And if they don't, there'll be more price to pay.
Right.
This is my personal opinion, but the Iranians have been facilitating the murder of civilians for too long, and it's got to stop.
All right. As we bring this to a close, Glenn, is there anything else you ask people to watch or you think should be top of mind as we go another week or two into the future here?
Well, I think, again, we're going to have to watch the stability issue in Syria, the potential for a reemergence of very extremist groups that are going to cause a lot of havoc. The spread of that into Europe or into towards our allies, including Israel, which we should be ready to help our allies stop that from happening. Even the Turks have to be worried about some kind of backlash because they also have a very large Syrian population in Turkey, and they have a long common border. So we're going to have to watch all that. And I would just appeal to all Americans, this is the time where we need to show unity and stick together, because that is the most powerful message. I think that these dictators, when they see that, they get very nervous that the United States is not going to be divided and it's not going to be conquered. And then the last thing I will say is this gives Giants fans hope, because a couple of years ago, no one thought the Syrian opposition was going to take their country back, and they did. So has it been the greatest couple of years? But I'm wearing my Giants hat.
For those listening, that's the New York Giants, not the San Francisco Giants.
For your San Francisco Giants fan too, we'll support you. But
all right, thanks a lot, Glenn. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Great seeing you. Thanks for having me.